this time I'm going to do a little something different. I know I said I wouldn't read any creepypastas, but I changed my mind. Yeah, I mean, I want to read them, but I was worried about a lot of things. Anyways, this will be my first attempt. I'm going to do a pasta of the month for September 2014. This one will be Out in the Woods. The link will be in the description and stuff, and there will only be one picture for this, so you won't really have to watch, just listen. So anyways, I hope you enjoy this, and if you have any other suggestions, just tell me. Out in the Woods. Hey, that guy. Just thought I'd share a couple of spooky stories from my childhood to get everyone all hyped for Halloween. When I was a child, it was just me and my mother. We lived in a property owned by my grandma, a 3-story old farmhouse right in the fringe of the woods. It was far off the road, down a long, unlit gravel driveway. It felt very isolated at night, being so distant from many other houses, set in an area that hadn't been inhabited for 30 years. I was a very rambunctious child, so while my mom went off to work, I would occasionally skip the morning bus to school and stay home alone all day. The big house had a habit of feeling incredibly lonely and sparse, so I spent most of my time playing in the forest expanse out back. Some distance into the woods, far enough that I couldn't hear my mother when she called, there was a toppled pine tree which had crashed into another, and even a larger trunk on its way down, and now was frozen there, forming a long arc over the forest floor. I loved to climb up the jagged stump at the base of the tree, and then steady myself to a point just above the middle. I was never able to make it all the way to the top, because it just got too steep for me to continue any further, and I had a bad habit of freaking out from how high up I was. One day, I was sitting in my usual spot on the fallen tree, which was a good distance from the ground, just listening to the birds singing, and simultaneously feeling the warmth of the sun on my neck, when I heard something paralyzed me in shock. "Hey, kid!" I was gripped by a sudden strong surge of fear for a moment. The voice had come from directly underneath me. I strained to look down, but couldn't see anything over the ledge. For a long time I sat there in absolute silence, and I was at the point where I almost soon convinced myself that I had imagined hearing a man's voice at all. "I know you can hear me." His voice was much louder this time, as I yelled something out and scrambled up the log a bit higher. Trembling nervously, I dug my fingernails into the bark and held tight for dear life. I sat there, trying to collect my nerves for God knows how long. Although I couldn't see it, the presence of this thing underneath me was clear. The bird's song was much softer and more cautious this time, and when I listened closely, I swear I could hear the faintest echo of human breathing. Gathering all my courage, I vowed to prove myself that it was all my imagination by leaning over the edge as far as I possibly could without slipping right off. Digging hard into the bark behind me, I stretched out along my arms and peered over, getting a full view of the empty forest floor and undergrowth. "Come down here, or I'll come up and grab you," It was so loud, it was as if I was being screamed right in my face. I released my grip on the tree and plunged off the platform. I was saved only by grabbing a nearby branch, and for one awful second my bare legs dangled in the cool air. When I pulled myself up, I ran at full speed to the top of the collapsed pine, to the point I had never reached before. I sat there, just below the rustling canopy, pissing myself and staring at the distant space where the splintered wood rose, fully expecting at the moment to see someone crawling rapidly up the pine towards me. Instead, all I heard was the wind rustling in the leaves above and below me, and occasionally snippets of bird song. It was about 2 hours before my mother got home and found me, after much worried searching, trembling, and crying at the top of the fallen tree. This incident spooked both me and my mother. In time, I somehow recovered, and exhibiting the naive, hard skin of a child, although I'd never went as far into the forest as I used to. Once when I was 12, I had the chore of taking firewood from the shed out back, just at the edge of the woods, and to bring it back inside the house. It was a tiresome job, and I always chose to do it at dusk, when the air was brimming with mosquitoes and swampy fog that usually coated the lawn. By the time I had made my last round, I would sprint back to the house spooked. One of my least favorite things about this job was that the shed was full of barn owls. If you've ever seen a barn owl's face staring at you from the dark corner, then you will know how uncomfortable that shed made me. One of these nights it got mistier than it had ever been before. A thick silver fog covered everything and limited my line of sight to a short sphere around me. Even though the shed wasn't far from the house, I found myself feeling disoriented, and more than once I walked in the wrong direction, both times for some reason walking straight into the woods. By the time I reached my last load, it was too foggy to see the street. My eyes stung in the moisture and it made my vision blur. Lurching forward, I managed to walk headfirst into a tree, doubling over and dropping all the wood I was bundling onto my feet with a hard crunch. As I went to pick them up, with my foot throbbing pretty hard, I realized that the ground was too misty for me to see my own knees. I decided to head to the house, since we had more than enough wood for one night. However, it was getting pretty dark, and I couldn't make out any signifiers of which direction I was heading in. Even though I cautiously walked for several feet in all directions, trying to figure out my position in the mist, I still couldn't figure out any point of identification. I couldn't even locate the fence or the gate, and the more I walked, the more I seemed to stumble into trees, pine needles, and mud crunching under my feet instead of dew-covered lawn. After a while, I finally realized that I couldn't even find the shed anymore. Cursing myself for being so dumb, while trying to ignore my thumping heart and sense that someone else was at play, I became aware that I was lost somewhere in the fringe of the forest. Screaming out for Mother in the loudest possible volume was only met with resounding silence from the depths of the mist around from where I stood, affirming that I wandered too far from the house to be heard. As a deep panic startled to settle on me, I noticed a glimpse of something pink moving against a nearby pine trunk. Coming closer, I saw that it was a ripped-out square of pink paper. On it there was an arrow pointing up. Looks vaguely like something my mom might make. I rationalized to keep from getting lost, so foolishly I followed the direction set by the green arrow, shivering. I kept walking for about 5 to 10 more minutes before needing to stop to take a breath. My heart was pounding so fast, it was beginning to hurt. I was sitting down, however. I spied what appeared to be another note fluttering on a nearby trunk. I noted this one emmed with a long nail. It bore another arrow, this one pointing up, and a small, sloppily written note that said, "This way." Despite my increasing panic, I convinced myself that these notes were the only shot at getting back before nightfall. I was desperate to get the hell out, and my brow was cold with sweat, so I followed the green arrow to a point where I could just dimly make out another spot of pink, up an incline of collapsed stumps and leaf litter. At this point, it was getting pretty dark, and I had to strain both my eyes just to see a few meters ahead of me. Following the green arrows, feeling less and less sure of where I was, I stumbled through the woods, groping out in the mist a field for trees, although I was terrified of some unseen thing grabbing my arm. I came across the third green note, which had another arrow pointing up again. This one led to an increasingly steep slope that I didn't recognize being anywhere near my house, and with a poorly drawn smiley face above it. At this stage, I became too freaked to cope and started to cry there a little. As I slumped against the green stump, the possibility that I would be out of the woods all night began to sink in, like a syringe being driven into the veins within my arm. I caught a glimpse of another pink square in the near distance. Squinting hard, unnerved by these notes, all of which looked fresh without sign of decay despite the previous week's non-stop rain, I read it from afar. What I read made my blood turn cold. I stood to my knees, dead silent, wobbling on them in fear. My ears were sensitive to any tiny prickle of noise in the mist. For a long time I stood there, in the rolling fog, reading and reading that horrible note over and over again, before a snapping stick somewhere behind me caused me to sprint blindly, twigs snagging at my ankles, cutting up my face as I ran. Written on the note, in big green letters, was my name. It felt like I was running for hours. All the while, the rain and mist lapped at the back of my neck, like the decaying breath of someone running right behind me. Somehow, I made it back to the house. All the lights were off, and I struggled to find the keys for a moment. When I found them, I bolted indoors and quickly crawled into bed where I remained, unsleeping till morning. Mom just thought I'd come inside and gone to bed, and hadn't thought to leave the lights on. It was a miracle, aka some freakish coincidence, that I even found the house at all. The final incident at that damn house was witnessed only by my mother. Up until then, she had never experienced any of the strange things as I had, although we mutually shared a peculiar oppressive quality that the house's interior had on us, and its placement in the dreary, imposing woods. Although I was obviously never a popular kid, by living out in the country in the opposite direction from everyone else at my school, I did make some tight friends in my first year of high school. One of these friends, Amanda was her name, invited me over one night, and I accepted. Out to the place, which was about 3 miles away, then drove back home. The night went well. We watched horror movie, suitably, devoured some pizza, and probably smoked a little pot. My mother went home alone, where she intended to get some writing done. She worked for a magazine at that point, and it was about midnight when I received an off-putting text from Mom, in all caps. "Is this a prank? I need to know immediately." Thinking it was some kind of joke, I texted back, "Calm yourself. This is what a prank." Almost immediately the response, "Are you at the house?" Of course I responded, "No," though I was thoroughly weirded out. I didn't receive another message until around when she told me to go to my grandmother's in the morning and to not, by any means, dare go home. I remember those weak torrents of rain the day I went to my grandmother's, and how terribly soaked I was when I finally got there. It was nearly 2 towns away. I had to fight the temptation to go home and drop off my bags, but Mom's disturbing message from last night were enough of a warning not to do so. When I arrived, Mom and Grandma were having lunch. At first, my mother seemed to be in some sort of composed state, but when I got a better look at her, I noticed that all of the color had drained from her face, and she was slightly trembling. At one point, she even sent a small glass crashing to the floor after flinching at the cat brushing around her ankles. When my grandma was sound asleep, that she told me what happened. She went further as to forbid me from telling old Grandma, out of fear that it would horrify her superstitious soul too much. This is what happened the night when I was at Amanda's, as she described it in lurid detail. My mother was sitting on the first story in the living room, where she sat on the couch by the fire, curtains open to view the sunset of the king over her latest draft. At first, it was so faint that she barely noticed it, but after a while, my mother became aware of a vaguely irritated by tiny thumping noise near her head at the window. When she went over, she saw fat brown moths of the kind we had gotten at the place buzzing madly into the glass. Reasoning that this is the cause of the sound, she returned to her work, however, being rattled in the same way. It was when the noise started to get sharper and louder that she paid more attention, and saw that rocks were being thrown at the window from the total blackness of the forest edge. She saw them appear from the shadow of the bush, and then fall in an arc and bounce off the window. Looking carefully, she could see small cracks from where some heavy ones had hit, right beside where her head had been moments before. Temporarily captivated, she tried to peer into the darkness enough to make out where the rocks were being thrown. Then, with a startled shock, she jumped back from the window, and she saw me, standing half behind a tree right near the window, grinning wide and staring at her. My one visible eye stretched wide open, showing all of the white. She barely stifled a scream, seeing her own daughter standing there, just staring and smiling. Not only did the figure not move nor blink, it was standing by one of the nearest pines, far from where the rocks were shooting out of the bush, as they continued to do so in a loud downpour. My face increasingly continued to press at her, smiling. Thinking this was all some kind of sick prank, hence the later text, my mother shouted my name at the top of her lungs, frightened to the core. However, instead of responding, the mouth of the thing that looked like me behind the tree started moving as if it was mouthing silent words really, really fast. Suddenly, it turned its head to the side and seemed to be talking to someone else behind the tree. Mom said, who couldn't be seen, but she could see a formless black shape hanging against the side of the tree. The girl that looked like me kept staring at my mother and doing silent speed-talking thing, then turning and whispering to the thing next to her. Then she would turn back and start up again. Then, breaking the monotonous spell, she suddenly pointed straight at my mother and started laughing. My mother screamed and fled to my bedroom on the second story, the only room with a working lock, where she shut herself inside and sat at the far end of the bed as the rocks began to pitter-patter against the window downstairs, dry heaving and weeping in fear. In my room, my mother said she did not feel safe. It was an awful smell, and it was a weird humming noise in the walls, as she described. She tried to pray for a time before giving up and just listening to the rocks pelt the walls and windows. Somewhere in the kitchen, she got the distant, vibrant sound of a window actually smashing, and the weird, continuous humming. Listening more carefully, she could identify it as the softest hint of a mumbling. She recognized the voice, and then, virtually too afraid to look, she tilted her head to the closet door, where an awful white face had been staring right at her, mouth contorting and gaping in what sounded like highly sped-up whispering. The closet door was only a meter from my mother. It started to open slowly. In an unimaginable explosion of terror, she immediately bolted to the door, only to fumble with the lock as bigger and bigger rocks came crashing through the windows, which burst apart in a spray of glass shards before finally getting out, running out of the house, completely keeping her eyes off the woods. Right at the end of the prolonged driveway, she saw two unmistakable human forms standing at my broken bedroom window, watching as her car got further and further away from our house. This will be their final farewell, as my mother never stepped foot in that place again. As my mother told this story, she broke down in tears. I didn't doubt her, and I still don't. I honestly and fully believe that she experienced what she said she did. It was also quite clear that we were done living in that house for once and for all. I only went back once, with my dad, who I see rarely now. He came from another state to help us move. Mom had already found a place in town and moved in. My dad and I just loaded up his truck with all that was left inside there. It was a silent, sunny morning when we removed all the stuff and emptied the place. I wish I could say there was some closure, some final spooky to cap it all off. But there wasn't. It was just a relief to be out of there. A relief to be out of there. There are, however, only two things left worth mentioning. When we checked the house for any signs of intruders, we found that several windows, including in my bedroom and the kitchen, had been smashed with rocks lying on the floor. Dad went out to the trees for a bit to take a leak. When he came back, he asked how long we had the swing set for. Needless to say, we never had a swing set, so I was fairly unsettled to discover that in a week since we'd been gone, someone had a similar rope swing set from one of the highest branches of the old pine over the ridge, against which was a fallen log I'd stopped climbing many years ago. It was obviously a new rope, and a nicely polished, sanded down wooden seat at the base. Dad, wanting to keep my mind from recent events, he doubted the affair and thought my mother was unstable. Said that a neighbor probably set it up, not realizing it was on our property. Of course, he knew as well as I did that we had no neighbors for at least a mile in any direction. There was no house in all of that space, and never, in my time living there, did I ever see another sign of human habitation. But I let it all go, and was pleased enough just to say good riddance to that horrible place as we drove off for good. For the most part, I found it best to try and forget what happened at that place. Sometimes I just can't help but ponder, though. It's been long enough to now that I no longer feel scared thinking about it. But for a long while I couldn't. Seeing as it's Halloween, what better time to share? My grandma just recently sold the house to a new family. A young couple knew me after we moved out, despite my mother's insistence that it be left empty. Now she refuses to talk about what happened altogether. I'm less anxious about it, although sometimes I can't help it. Let my imagination get the better of me. All I can do is think of that old house, the fallen down tree, and the new occupants, and the swing out back, gently spinning in the breeze, as that little boy toddles obviously towards it.